tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to talk about that, but also the broader issue here and what's happening in British Columbia, which is just doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on so-called safe supply. Adam Zivo is a columnist and reporter with the National Post who has written extensively on this, probably more than most others in Canada, and it's always good to have him on the show. Adam, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Let's just talk about that Richmond video for a moment here before we get into your work on this, because I would say that the guy on the left is probably far more representative of a lot of suburban Canadians on these issues.
Well, the thing is that most racialized Canadians don't support the harm reduction radicalism that we see happening throughout Canada. I mean, yes, there's going to be a small portion of activists who think that giving out free drugs is integral to racial justice and social justice. But I mean, most immigrant communities are actually quite socially conservative. And especially for East Asians, when they see opioids being handed out so wantonly, for them, it's reminiscent of the opioid wars of the 1800s, when China was weakened by the UK coming in and essentially plowing their country with opioids. So I can understand there's a bit of colonial trauma there.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And to bring it back into the provincial realm here, I mean, I remember when supervised injection sites or so-called safe injection sites were seen as tremendously controversial, but now they're just an accepted fact. And the people that were advocating for that have been advocating for safe supply. It's not enough just to give someone a clean room and a clean needle. You have to provide them with so-called clean drugs. And you and I have spoken about this. We had a panel on this show with two of the experts who have spoken out about this. The data are not showing that this is working. And you're saying that BC is aware of that, but is still proceeding.
To some degree, they're aware of that it's not working. To another degree, they have access to bad research and they don't fully understand how flawed the research is. So back in January, the British Medical Journal published a study which claimed that safer supply reduced mortality by 55 to 91%. And that study was cited by the BC government when they announced that they were going to expand safer supply, despite the fact that it was causing community harms. And so I found that study a bit strange. So I reviewed it with a team of 7 physicians, as well as a scientist who's trained in stats analysis. And we found that the study cherry-picked its data. So there were 2 ways that it did that. So first of all, half of the people who received safer supply received evidence-based medications such as methadone and Suboxone, which are proven to reduce mortality. So obviously you ask yourself, well, what's actually causing the mortality reductions here? The methadone or the safer supply? The researchers tried to filter out the effects of methadone, but there were really big gaps in their methodologies that were kind of inexplicable. And we found in the data, there was a subpopulation of people who had not received these evidence-based medications in the 30 days before receiving safer supply. And for that population, there was no statistically significant reduction in mortality for safer supply patients, which suggests that any mortality reductions that did exist were driven by methadone and Suboxone, not by safer supply. But they ignored that. The second thing is that they measured mortality reductions after 1 week, which is really, really weird. And if you want to make a comparison, imagine if there was a new kind of insulin. And some researchers said, well, we're going to just study what the impact of the insulin is after 1 week, instead of looking at long-term outcomes of repeated administration over the course of a year. And when we looked at the data, we found out that the mortality rates between the safer supply and the non-safer supply patients was more or less the same after 1 year, indicating that whatever mortality reductions we saw after 1 week, if they even existed at all, were meaningless after a year. But of course, this was omitted as well. So this study, which showed that safer supply does not work, was repackaged as evidence that it does, which I think is unethical, but the BC government didn't catch up on that.
Now, do you think this is an example of, because there are lots of situations in which researchers start out down a path and they don't really realize, or for whatever reason, that what they're doing is maybe not providing the best picture or the most whole picture. Do you think that's the case here? Or do you think it's people that are deliberately designing studies so that they yield a particular outcome?
It would be hard to say how much of it is deliberate and how much of it is just a certain level of incompetence. What I will say is that safer supply advocates do have a tendency to exaggerate the quality of their research.
Well, they were a lot on self-reporting studies, which you and I have talked about in the past of, how do you feel about this program? Great. Yes, it's working.
Yeah, Andrew, I'm going to give you some free drugs. Do you feel like this program, which gives you free drugs that you can sell on the street, is great? Oh, you think it's great? Well, I guess that means it works. And we're not going to ask anyone else. Obviously, that doesn't work. So this is a step up. So they did a quality study, but the study didn't give them the results that they wanted to. So they seem to have misrepresented it. So once again, it's just really, I don't want to say that this is intentional because that's hard to prove, and I don't want to be sued for defamation.
Fair enough.
But what is that it does raise eyebrows.
Yeah, and I think that it is impossible to separate out ideology here and ideology among the research, and certainly ideology in BC. Now, look, if you want to say, this is our position, this is what we believe, this is what we're going to do, power to you. Let the voters decide. But it's when people are trying to hide what is ideological behind science that I tend to get a little bit concerned.
Yeah, I mean, look, so I was at the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine's annual scientific conference back in October. So I met a lot of safer supply advocates in real life and seem to be ideological, and they're kind of like, they're zealots, and you can show them whatever evidence that you have that this isn't working, that it's being diverted, and they do all sorts of mental gymnastics. So around that time, I was working on a piece where I had found dozens of examples of people selling thousands of safer supply hydromorphone pills on Reddit. And I was sitting beside a safer supply advocate in a presentation. And afterwards, I showed her all of this. And she was saying, well, how do we know that it's real? And there was some specific packaging, which is only used in safer supply. And she's saying, well, how do we know that, drug dealers didn't go and get that from the garbage and then put, fake drugs in it? And they were doing whatever they could to delegitimize this. And after a while, it just seemed like they were unwilling to accept the possibility that this program is not working, which is sad. And I can understand that psychologically, because no one wants to admit that this thing that you've staked your identity in, that you've put so much of your effort into advocating for, might actually be harming people.
How do BC health officials square the fact that this situation has just become such a major issue in BC relative to other provinces? I mean, why do they think that their approach is working when their outcomes don't seem to be better than elsewhere in the country?
Well, I mean, the way that they're looking at it is that they have this hypothesis, which is unfalsifiable. So they say that safer supply saves lives. And then when they don't see any evidence of that, they say, well, that just means that there's not enough safer supply. So in the way that they are framing it, it is impossible to disprove their hypothesis, which basically justifies the infinite expansion of safer supply. But we do have to keep in mind that many researchers are activists at heart, and they really strongly advocate for drug legalization, and safer supply is a step towards that. And I do want to stress that many of the people who are in this space right now who control addiction policymaking, they don't come from a medical background. They don't actually have medical degrees oftentimes. Many of them come from public health, which is much less rigorous. And then they basically have displaced the addiction physicians who are actually fully trained in this. So the people who are calling the shots are not fully educated on this matter.
And that was, I mean, the phenomenon we had discussed was on this panel that you were on the show a few months back with Sharon Koivu in London, Ontario, my city, where, here she's an actual physician, but she's kind of on the sidelines when a lot of these people you've just described seem to be setting the agenda.
Well, and that's the problem, right? Is that from what I have heard, it is the mainstream position in addiction medicine that addiction physicians and psychologists do not support safer supply. And that's what I heard at the very beginning when I was researching this. And no one wanted to speak up about it because they were afraid. They were afraid that they would be cyberbullied by harm reduction activists. They were afraid that they would lose access to federal grants. There was a culture of fear. And slowly that culture of fear has dissipated. And now you see more public criticism. But fundamentally speaking, addiction physicians are being sidelined. And they are being told that their very practice is oppressive. Harm reduction activists, for example, Zoe Dodd in Toronto, she's like one of the main ones. She has explicitly said that she wants to dismantle addiction medicine. And how do you deal with someone like that?
Yeah, no, that's a sometimes they say the quiet part out loud. So I think that's a very good point. Adam Zivo with the National Post, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.